Hello and welcome to our webinar, MMPI-3 Police Candidate Interpretive Report, or PCIR Overview. Our presenter today is Dr. David Corey. Dr. Corey is a licensed psychologist with more than 30 years of experience performing high-stakes evaluations of public safety applicants and employees. He is the founding president of the American Board of Police and Public Safety Psychology and a fellow of the American Psychological Association. He is board certified in forensic psychology and in police and public safety psychology with the American Board of Professional Psychology. Dr. Corey is licensed in Oregon, Washington, Hawaii, California, Utah, and Arizona. We also have Dr. Alexander Quiros with us today, and he will monitor the chat box for Dr. Corey. Before we begin, I would like to go over a few housekeeping items. This webinar is being presented in broadcast audio. Please turn up your computer speakers to hear the audio. There are no dial-in options. If you're having any connectivity or audio issues, please click on the question mark at the top right-hand side of your computer screen for assistance. Please type any questions that you have in the chat box. We will answer the questions live, time permitting, towards the end of the presentation. If we do not get to your question during this live event, please submit your question in the follow-up form at the end of the webinar to submit the question. The webinar handout is under your chat box. You click on Event Resources and you can download the file from there. And the only way to receive a certificate for today is to fill out the survey at the end of the webinar that you will receive. It will pop up and then you will get an email from do not reply at webcast.com with the link to your certificate. With all that being said, I'll turn it over to Dr. Corey.
Well, good afternoon or good morning, depending upon where you're situated. I want to begin this webinar by disclosing my financial interests. I receive research funding from the University of Minnesota Press. And as co-author of the MMPI-2 RF and MMPI-3 Police Candidate Interpretive Reports, I also receive royalties on the sale of the reports and derivative books. Today's agenda, just to review, is we're going to give a brief overview of the MMPI-3 findings from studies of police candidates involving the MMPI-2 RF and MMPI-3. An overview of the police candidate interpretive report, practice recommendations and interpretive thresholds associated with scores on the MMPI-3 for use in screening police applicants, and then new job relevant correlates that are available on the MMPI-3 police candidate interpretive report that are not on the MMPI-2 RF PCIR. Now, what I'd like to do is get a better understanding of the experience and exposures that you had to the MMPI-3 and the MMPI-2 RF and the PCIR. So Sherry's going to pose a series of polls to help guide my understanding of that experience. So the first question is, have you had prior training on the MMPI-3? You would indicate yes or no.
And Dr. Corey, they do have 1 minute to fill this out. So as you can see, the results are in. If you go to the survey tab.
Got it. And so that will be updated as more participants come in, or is that what we have now, Sherry? Is that the...
That will continue to update, and
all right.
I can send out the second poll now.
Go ahead. Thank you. Second question is, have you had experience with the MMPI, have you had experience with the MMPI-2 police candidate interpretive report? I'm sorry, the next question is, have you had experience with the MMPI-2 RF? Great, the vast majority of you have had experience with the MMPI-2RF. And then the last question is, have you had experience with the MMPI-2RF Police Candidate Interpretive Report?
And those results should be coming in shortly.
Okay, so the just over half have had experience with the, well, maybe just about 2/3 or a third have had experience with the PCIR for the MMPI-2RF. Looks like just about 40%. And 75% have had experience with the MMPI-2RF. And about 42% have had prior training on the MMPI-3, and the remaining 58% have not. Well, thank you. That was very helpful and helps me understand where I will perhaps need to focus throughout the training. So let's move on to what we have planned for today. Now, unfortunately, for those of you who have had no prior experience with the MMPI-3, I'm not going to be going scale by scale over each of the scales for the MMPI-3. But for those of you who have had experience with the MMPI-2RF, most of the scales that are on the RF are also on the 3. There's some changes that we'll be talking about during this portion of the presentation. First, in terms of the items on the MMPI-3, there are 335 items in comparison to the 338 items that were on the MMPI-2RF. 72 of these are new items that have been added for the MMPI-3. 75 of the MMPI-2RF items have been dropped. So of those 335 items, 220 are original MMPI items. 47 of them were revised for the MMPI-2 or the MMPI-3. There are 43 MMPI-2 items, 5 of which were revised for the MMPI-3, and the other 72 are new MMPI-3 items. And the reading level remains the same, grade 4.5, using the Flesch-Kincaid scale. In contrast to the 51 scales on the MMPI-2RF, the MMPI-3 has 52 scales, 10 validity scales, so it adds a new validity scale, the Combined Response Inconsistency, or CRIN scale. The other validity scales remain the same. Because this is not a revision of the MMPI-2RF, the R's have been dropped on all the scales named, so LR is now L, KR is now K, etc. There are 3 higher order scales, just as with the MMPI-2RF, unchanged. There are 8 restructured clinical scales. One of the restructured clinical scales on the MMPI-2RF, or even on the MMPI-2, which also held the same RC scales, and that's RC3, or cynicism, has now been included among the externalizing specific problems scales. There are 26 specific problem scales, 4 somatic, cognitive, 10 internalizing, 7 externalizing, and 5 interpersonal specific problem scales. And then there are, of course, 5 Psi-5 scales. Importantly, the MMPI-3 has a entirely new normative sample. The normative sample for the MMPI-2 was gathered more than 30 years ago, before anyone was using the internet. Society has changed substantially, and the new norms gathered for the MMPI-3 demonstrate that. The MMPI-2RF utilized the same normative group as the MMPI-2RF. And so with the MMPI-3 has come an entirely new normative sample. This normative sample was selected to approximate the 2020 census projections, including for race, education, and age. And the final sample consists of 1,620 participants, 810 men, 810 women, and the normative sample uses non-gendered T-scores. And of course, consistent with the Civil Rights Act of 1991, in any employment-related or test used in an employment setting, scores cannot be modified or adjusted on the basis of any federally protected class. That includes gender, of course, and as well as race. And so as a consequence, we use a non-gendered sample for the police candidate comparison group that we'll be talking about shortly. Now, there's a substantial body of literature already collected on the predictive predictive use or the validity of scale scores on the MMPI-2 for predicting police candidate performance and other outcomes. The question, of course, that is pertinent to the MMPI-3 is the extent to which these studies, which are listed here are 9 of the studies that are used for identifying job-relevant correlates in the MMPI-2 and the MMPI-3. The important question is the extent to which the studies are applicable to the MMPI-3. And the answer to that question it requires examination of the MMPI-3 correlations with external variables. In particular, we're concerned with their correlation with concurrently measured variables, such as their indications of biodata, personal history information, and personality measures, such as the scores on the California Psychological Inventory that were administered at the same time as the candidate was administered the MMPI-3 for purposes of the pre-employment selection. And the subjects in the police candidate comparison group, as well as all the research that we have gathered, were all administered the MMPI instrument in the course of their pre-employment psychological evaluation. Now, because the as is detailed in the technical manual and in the MMPI-3 manual for administration, scoring, and interpretation indicates, the MMPI-2 and the additional items that were being explored for inclusion in the MMPI-3, the 95 items that were considered for inclusion, 72 of which were ultimately included, were all part of what was referred to as the EX version of the test. And the MMPI-2 EX allowed the MMPI-2 to be scored and utilized, and then the additional items were used for ultimately for test development purposes. So this allowed us to gather data over the last, I think it was approximately 5 years, while we were gathering validity evidence for the MMPI-3 to continue to use the MMPI-2 So what we'll be discussing a bit later in the presentation is evidence that shows that the concurrently measured variables for the MMPI-3, that those correlations are as expected and that they predict the same variables as does the MMPI-2 The technical manual is shown here. Of course, the manual for administration, scoring, and interpretation, as well as the technical manual, are key companions for understanding and interpreting the MMPI-3. And anyone using the test, I want to encourage to have those available to you. Now, in the technical manual, in Appendix D, we list the external correlates And as you'll see here, we have the police candidates from a sample in the Pacific Northwest where I reside and data part of our practice. Those tables are listed, or one of these tables here, table D89 is listed here, showing correlations between MMPI-3 higher order scales and the restructured clinical scales with the self-report measures. These include two classes or categories of self-report measures. The ones on the top left are biodata cluster variables. Those would be self-reported history using a standardized personal history inventory questionnaire. And then the bottom left include California Psychological Inventory probability variables produced by the Johnson-Roberts version of the Public Safety Selection Report of the CPI. Here is a sample of men with the N between 351 and 472. And as you can see here, as we would expect, behavioral externalizing dysfunction correlates with alcohol use problems, drug use problems, and failure to meet obligations with correlations of 0.2 and higher. And with theft-related problems and violation of the law. So these are correlations that we would expect to see, that prior studies have shown, and we see that they exist for the MMPI-3 as well. On the CPI, we would expect, of course, those to correlate with poor psychological suitability, as well as anger problems, alcohol use problems, illegal drug use problems, substance use proclivity, all at levels either above 0.5 or approximating it. This is all consistent with prior literature. And so these tables demonstrate that what we see in terms of expected correlations on the MMPI-3 with other external variables are what we would see with the MMPI-2 RF. We see here with RC4, other variables. I'm not going to go ahead and read all of these for you. But these are all detailed in the technical manual. Here we have with all three higher order scales and demoralization, correlation with poor psychological suitability, and a broad array of the RC scales as well. With involuntary departure, correlates with behavioral externalizing dysfunction, at point, if I can read that correctly, 0.20, as well as correlations with other RC scales. Here we have a sample of women, a smaller sample, demonstrating also the expected correlations for both male and female samples, just as we saw with the male sample. In Appendix E of the technical manual are comparisons between the MMPI-2 RF and the MMPI-3 scale correlations. Both a sample from the Pacific Northwest as well as one out of Southern California. Here's a sample involving the Pacific Northwest sample. And we can see the comparison between the between BXD, or behavioral externalizing dysfunction, on the RF and behavioral externalizing dysfunction on the MMPI-3. And you see that these are all comparable correlations within these red circles, indicating that we have the same, we have comparable external correlations with external variables as we would expect to see with the MMPI-2 RF. Here too, with poor psychological suitability, emotional internalizing dysfunction on the RF as at 0.29, and emotional internalizing dysfunction on the MMPI-3 is 0.31. With the BXD, it's 0.5 and 0.5. So we see comparability across the expected correlations between the two measures. Here is with the, this table shows the prediction of external correlates post-hire. So rather than concurrent validation, which we've been, or I should say, the validation with concurrently administered measures of personality and biodata, we're now looking at predictions of post-hire performance. So does the MMPI-3 scales predict the post-hire performance as we have seen in the MMPI-2RF? So here, as an example, we have, I'm going to blow this up a little bit. It's a little hard for me to see here. Oh, there we go. So RC8 correlates with academic learning problems, 0.29 for the RF, and for the MMPI-3, 0.29. Here in this circle, we see that the RC8 on the RF correlates with report writing problems, 0.3. On the MMPI-3, 0.27. Whether or not these are global items, and the agency is asked, this is typically questions asked of the, or they are all questions asked of the field training coordinator. Would you hire a recruit similar to the one that's being evaluated? RC8 on the RF correlates with that response, 0.26, and on the MMPI-3, 0.25. Overall performance of the recruit, 0.27 on the RF and 0.25. So we see very comparable correlations, both convergent and discriminant correlations. And here with the composite variables, these are what I was reading earlier were individual variables. These are all composite variables taking a number of different clustered problems that are conceptually comparable. We have cognitive adaptation problems with RC8, 0.25 on the RF, 0.28 on the 3. Constraint problems in a police recruit, 0.34 on the RF, 0.27 on the 3. And then we see in this circle all very comparable correlations, 0.26, 0.24, 0.3, 0.23, 0.24, et cetera. So we can conclude from these and other findings on these tables that what we have seen in terms of the prediction of the MMPI-2RF generalizes to the MMPI-3 producing comparable scores and comparable correlations with external variables. Consequently, we're able to generalize and utilize all of the findings associated with police studies from the MMPI-2RF and apply those to the findings on the MMPI-3, or apply those to the scores on the MMPI-3 to make score inferences. This is the MMPI-3 Police Candidate Interpretive Report User's Guide. And in the user's guide, we detail the composition of the police candidate comparison group. Now, people often erroneously describe this as the police norms. They're not actually norms. There's really only one normative group, and that's the normative sample. The 2020 normative sample for the MMPI-3, just as there is a normative sample for the MMPI-2RF, and that's the normative sample that was gathered in the 1980s. The police candidate comparison group, in contrast to the normative sample, is a sample of police applicants that enable us to determine whether or not the score for a given applicant is deviant from other persons who took the test under like conditions. Keeping in mind that there are a wide range of pre-selection and selection factors that reduce the variability of scores, that create a more homogeneous population of applicants who have applied to become police officers, largely result of a extensive vetting process by the use of civil service examinations and background investigations that weed out applicants with significant problems. Now, we know that there's a relationship between problematic behavior and psychological functioning. And so as a consequence, when people are weeded out on the basis of behavioral problems and interpersonal problems and conscientiousness problems and impulse control problems, as a consequence, we see that there is a restriction of range on the scores and a lower mean and standard deviation in comparison to the normative sample. So this is the importance of having a comparison group, is it allows us to take folks who or subjects who were administered the test under similar circumstances for a similar purpose, so that we're comparing apples and apples. The police candidate comparison group for the MMPI-3 comes from a broad geographic region, the Southeast, South, Midwest, Rocky Mountains, Northwest, Southern California, for a total of 1,924, equal numbers of men and women because we use a non-gendered sample. They are largely from the suburbs, next from more urban areas, and a fifth of them are from rural areas. A bit of an overrepresentation of African Americans in the sample, and a bit of an underrepresentation of Hispanic respondents in the sample. The sample of white applicants is just about right at 60%, and then 1.4% Asians, 1.8% other, mixed race 4.6%. So it's quite a diverse sample as well, and significantly fewer whites than in prior comparison groups. Now, this is the police candidate interpretive report police comparison group, police candidate comparison group, and we see, just as we would expect, that they are far more attentive on the test. Krin, Vren, and Tren Krin and Bren are below the mean for the normative sample, which is, of course, always 50 and a standard deviation of 10. And we see that the standard deviations, we see down at the bottom row, that the standard deviations are half the size of the normative sample. And with the over-reporting scales with F, FP, FS, FBS, and RBS, we also have much smaller standard deviations with scores, mean scores that are below 50. For the under-reporting scale scores, L and K, L has a mean of 57 and a standard deviation of 12, and K a standard deviation of 7 and a mean of 65. Now, of course, the L does not stand for lie in this context, certainly not, because we cannot attribute from a score whether or not a candidate is lying. We know from both practice and from research that we can derive three hypotheses from elevated L and K scores in the context of personnel selection. One is that the candidate is who he or she says they are, that they are morally virtuous, that they strive to abide by social expectations, and that they're psychologically well-adjusted. The other hypothesis is that they are all those things, but not quite to the level that they allege. That is, they are exaggerating their virtuousness and their psychological adjustment. And the third hypothesis is that they're engaged in active deceit, that they don't have the moral virtues they claim to have, and that they are not psychologically well-adjusted at all. What the PCIR will help us to do is to identify those other items on the test that are potentially historically verifiable. That is, they report past behaviors that can be verified through background investigation to help us determine, along with other resources, whether the person is engaged in active deception or is simply a morally virtuous and well adjusted applicant. As a consequence of the significant vetting, as well as the demand characteristics of the situation producing elevated L and K, we also see that the means and standard deviations on the substantive scale scores are lower than in comparison to the normative sample. So emotional internalizing dysfunction has a mean of 37, standard deviation of 5. Thought dysfunction, a mean of 42, a standard deviation of 6. And you can see all along the bottom row that the means are substantially lower than for the normative sample, as are the standard deviations, reflecting a restriction of range that is characteristic of this population. For those of you who are experienced with the RF, and that's about 3/4 of you, we're presenting data here just as you would see it in any score report using a comparison group. The open circles reflect the mean for the comparison group. The gray bar above and below represents a standard deviation above and below. So the larger the standard deviation, the broader that gray bar, the tighter the standard, smaller the standard deviation, the tighter that gray bar. So we see that here with demoralization as one example. Mean of 39, a standard deviation of 4. So a score that falls outside of the standard deviation above or below will indicate that relative to the comparison group, the score is deviant. And we see that here as well. Go back, we see this is true on the somatic and cognitive domain and the internalizing domain. Now, we see here with compulsivity, CMP, this is a new scale on the MMPI-3, that the standard deviation for the comparison group approximates, as does the mean and standard deviation for the normative sample at 47 and 8. For those of you who are familiar with the RF, but not the 3, there are a couple of changes we can point out here. EAT is a new scale measuring eating concerns or problematic eating behavior. We had on the MMPI-2 RF, Yossi and Aka had a scale called stress and worry, and now they're broken into 2 scales of stress and worry. The anxiety scale has been modified substantially and is now anxiety-related experiences, or ARX, and otherwise these scales are named just as they are and exist as they are on the RF with some item modifications. Again, same pattern with externalizing. You can see that cynicism, the previous RC3, is now one of the externalizing specific problem scales. And family problems has been placed in the externalizing domain. We have dominance is just the inverse of interpersonal passivity. It used to be the IPP scale, and it has just been reversed, so now it measures dominance. IPP always measured dominance, but simply as a low score, and dominance measures interpersonal passivity, but just as a low score. SFI is a new scale on the MMPI-3, and SFI is the self-importance scale measuring beliefs related to having special talents and abilities. And the mean for the police candidate comparison group is at 51 and a standard deviation of 8. And the Psi-5, we see that the mean is slightly lower for the MMPI-3 on disconstraint at 42, and otherwise very comparable to what we saw on the RF. Now, an important question is how the comparison group for the MMPI-2 RF compares to the comparison group for the MMPI-3. And we know from the normative sample, from the renorming of the MMPI-3, that there are societal changes in the underreporting scale scores. They're reflected here in the scores on LR for what was LR on the RF and now L on the 3. And that's a mean of 59 for the RF, standard deviation of 13, slightly higher standard deviation of 14, and a mean of 63. KR previously on the RF had a mean of 63 and a standard deviation of 8, now has a mean of 65 and a standard deviation of 7. Again, reflecting what is a highly vetted group to begin with. Very comparable scores with BXD being slightly lower, reflecting a difference in the normative sample. Otherwise, these are very comparable scores between the two comparison groups, comparing the police candidate comparison group for the RF and for the 3. So let's move to a discussion and overview of the MMPI-3 Police Candidate Interpretive Report. Now, the rationale for the PCIR, whether we're talking about the RF version or the 3, remain the same. When I'm referring to statistics, I'll be referring to the statistics associated with the MMPI-3. And that is that there are over 287 to be exact, job-relevant correlates that are identified by the police candidate studies that I referenced earlier. These involve 37 of the 42 substantive scales on the MMPI-3. And the thresholds for interpreting those inferences are at 14 different T-score levels below 65T. Oh, pardon me. I know the literature quite well, and I know the instrument quite well, having worked with it for so many years. There's no way I can hold in my head what all those 287 correlates are for the 37 substantive scales, and at which of the 14 different T-score levels the inferences are to be triggered. So the efficiency and error control provided by a computerized report allows us to avoid two common problems in police screening. One is failing to identify correlates that are supported by the literature associated with a particular score. And 3 is erroneously making inferences that are not supported, either by not properly identifying the scale that can be interpreted at a score below 65, or recognizing that there is a proper inference to be made with a score under 65, but at the wrong T-score level. The PCIR is focused on predicting consequential behavior, 28 different job performance outcomes, as well as 47 job-relevant personality and behavioral characteristics. It allows for comparison of scores both to the normative sample and to the police candidate comparison group. And they provide an identical presentation of scores, figures, and tables as you would see in the score report. So all of the information that you would obtain by producing your results using the score report are included in the PCIR, as well as additional information that we'll turn to next. In this sample of a report that is in the user's guide for the PCIR, Mr. E, we see that the first pages of the report are entirely the same as what you would see in the score report. Here, of course, we're seeing on this elevation on THD that this person has a raw score of 6, T-score of 60, answered all of the items associated with that scale. That's what the 100 means. This compares to the police candidate the police candidate comparison group to a mean of 42 with a standard deviation of 6, and essentially reaching a 99.5% percentile, that is the percentage scoring at or below the test taker, or 99.5%. Now, this tells us nothing about what proper inferences can be drawn, and we can't draw inferences about a score of 60 on THD by looking it up in the Manual for Administration Scoring and Interpretation, because these define scores in most cases at 65 or above. There's some exceptions, suicide, death ideation being one, and as well as some low scores. But in most cases, the interpretive inferences to be drawn from scores in the Manual for Administration Scoring and Interpretation are based upon scale scores at or above 65. And we certainly can't look up THD in the manual, look at the interpretation associated with 65 and say, well, it's pretty close to what we would interpret at 65, so the person is sort of that description. I don't know what happened here, folks, so let me, all right, there we go. So if we're going to interpret a score below a level of 65, and again, notwithstanding those very low score interpretations that are supported by, or that are discussed in the manual, we need to have evidence based upon empirical studies. And so that's what this PCIR does, is it informs the test user about the empirically supported inferences that can be drawn by scale scores that are not evidence of clinical dysfunction. Now, where the score report begins to change is on page 7 of the PCIR. Although this looks in large part identical to what you would see in the score report, the difference here is in the bold fonting of the scores, as you see here. All of the thought dysfunction scores, as well as dominance and aggression from the interpersonal functioning domain. And what the bold types tell us is that these scores are interpreted in the report. So we can see at a glance what scores will be interpreted in the report, that is, are considered significant and inferences to be drawn from them. Just as with the PCIR, using the MMPI-3 it begins with some boilerplate language, which is always placed in italicized form. Not sure that the, there they go. So the text in italics is the boilerplate language. Then we have a brief overview of the major findings. And then in the protocol validity, we provide information about 3 types of threats to the validity of the protocol: content non-responsiveness, which includes unscorable and inconsistent responses, over-reporting, and under-reporting. We then move to a discussion of clinical findings, and this contains clinical level symptoms, personality characteristics, and behavioral tendencies, and as well as diagnostic considerations. The diagnostic considerations can be suppressed by the user if you, prior to printing the report, if you indicate whether using Q local or Q global that you don't want to include, or you would wish to suppress the diagnostic considerations, they won't be printed in your report. Then comes a description of the substantive scale findings in the context of the police candidate comparison group. In other words, it tells you how unusual a scale score is, indicating what % of the comparison group members conveyed the construct at or above that level, and what its implications may be for public safety functioning. It describes the construct that's being measured by the scale, and as I indicated, the percentage of the comparison group who scored at or beyond that level. The job-relevant personality characteristics and behavioral tendencies of the test taker are described under the job-relevant correlates heading. And they're organized according to 10 problem domains that have been modeled after the California Post-Psychological Screening dimensions. It also contains item level information, the content of which has been redacted to maintain test security in this webinar. But they would normally be printed out so that you can understand what items the person has responded to in the key direction. It tells you how they answered as true or false, what percentage of the normative sample answered that item in the key direction, and what percentage of the police candidate comparison group answered that item in the key direction. So we can see that item 179 was answered as true by looks like 8.3% of the normative sample, but only 1% of the police candidate comparison group. Now, these are all user-designated item level information to indicate at what T-score you would want to see these items. You can also have no T-score level and have all the items produced, as well as critical follow-up items. And these contain items that police officer candidate screening experts identified as ones that should be that the test user should be alerted to for possible further discussion during the clinical interview. An endnote section is included indicating whether that is, what is the empirical basis for the inference. Tells you whether it's a test response, an inference, or a correlate. It also indicates for all correlates what published research you can go to find the details supporting that. And that's useful either if you're simply trying to better understand the underlying construct, the variables that it predicts, or to determine whether or not a person with a particular demographic whether that inference is likely to be applicable given their differences from the sample that was being studied. In each case where there's an empirical correlate, you see a reference number, and these reference numbers refer to the research studies here. And you can use the hypertext to link to the individual study for your perusal. Now, what I'm going to discuss next is the comparison of T-score cutoffs for generating statements in the comparison group findings section of the PCIR versus the job relevant correlate section of the MMPI-2 RF and the MMPI-3 PCIR. In the MMPI-2 RF, different cut scores were used for generating comparison group findings in JRCs, or job relevant correlates. For the MMPI-3, whatever T-score is used for generating a comparison group finding is also used for generating a job relevant correlate if one exists. So in the case of somatic complaints, RC1, the MMPI-2 RF, a comparison group finding was produced at a T-score of 54. For the no job relevant correlates were associated with a score of 54 or higher on RC1. For the MMPI-3, that same comparison group finding is triggered at a score of 55, and no job relevant correlate is also associated with that scale score. With malaise on the MMPI-2 RF, a score of 57 produced a comparison group finding but no job relevant correlate. On the MMPI-3, a score of 59 produces both a comparison group finding and one or more job relevant correlates at the same T-score level. For eating concerns, if you see any row that is printed in this amber color, in this case, eating concerns, that's a new scale on the MMPI-3. It is not interpreted until a T-score of 65. There are no job-relevant correlates that have been identified with eating concerns, but comparison group findings are produced at a T-score of 65. Cognitive complaints, 54 and 53. I won't go through all of these, but these are all available for your perusal after the presentation. But you can see the changes that take place in these scale scores as a result of differences both in item configuration as well as new items added to the test and a different normative group. So the T-scores vary. In many cases, the T-score level is much lower for triggering the comparison group finding and its related job-relevant correlate. We see here for helplessness and hopelessness, a T-score of 60 triggered a comparison group finding, as well as a JRC. For the MMPI-3, it's 58. Dysfunctional negative emotions, 55 for the MMPI-2RF, 53 for the comparison. For the MMPI-3. In all cases, these T-scores have been set to not over-capture a large population that would over-predict a sample in a screening group, and it limits it to approximately 5% of the comparison group or to a sample. Here we have stress and worry. These blue rows, or rows in blue font, indicate scales that no longer exist on the MMPI-3 and that have been replaced by, in this case, stress and worry. 57 previously produced a T-score, now is 53 and 54 for stress and worry, respectively. And we see that on the thought dysfunction scales, the behavioral externalizing scales. New scale impulsivity has both comparison group findings and job relevant correlates triggered at 58T. And the new self-importance scale is interpreted both at a low score of 40 and a high score of 72 for comparison group findings, as well as job relevant correlates. Now, 37 of the 42 MMPI-3 substantive scales, that is 88.1% of them, trigger both comparison group findings and job relevant correlate statements. And as I indicated earlier, for each scale, the same T-score is used. Whereas only 28 of the 38 MMPI-2RF scales triggered both, and of those 28 scales, 17 use different T-scores for generating comparison group findings and JRC statements. So the MMPI-3 will be a bit easier to master in terms of identifying what scales produce inferences that are supported by the literature. Now, there are some new job-relevant correlates, and these are all will be printed in blue. There are 53 new correlations involving 32 job-relevant correlates, 10 of which are new to the MMPI-3 PCIR. As examples, difficulties coping with stress are job-relevant correlates triggered by elevations on stress and on worry. Being easily irritated and annoyed by others, not surprisingly triggered by anger problems. Worrying about problems and being uncertain about how to deal with them, triggered by introversion and low positive emotion or low positive emotionality. Being made anxious by change and uncertainty, by shyness, behaving in a self-defeating fashion, also by shyness. Difficulties performing under stressful conditions, triggered by RC8, disaffiliativeness, and psychoticism. New job-relevant correlates, cognitive adaptation problems, also triggered by aberrant experiences, cognitive complaints, helplessness, hopelessness, inefficacy, disaffiliativeness, and negative emotionality. Report writing problems triggered by aberrant experiences, inefficacy, helplessness, hopelessness, and activation. Another new job-relevant correlates, difficulties with effective decision-making, also triggered by aberrant experiences and psychoticism. Self-importance and dominance trigger the job-relevant correlate of being more likely to brush off criticism and other negative feedback. Dominance and self-importance triggering being less likely to reflect on the individual's behavior. Another new one, history of committing theft, behavioral externalizing dysfunction, antisocial tendencies, juvenile conduct problems, and disconstraint. Two other new correlates, history of failing to meet obligations, also triggered by antisocial behavior, problems with punctuality and attendance, triggered by a wide array of scales, and the second new one on this page, problems with conscientiousness, triggered by aberrant experience, by thought dysfunction, aberrant experiences, and psychoticism. Now, keep in mind, when we're interpreting scales on or scores on these scales, measuring thought dysfunction, we're not measuring psychotic levels of thought dysfunction or clinically significant thought dysfunction. We're measuring a construct that is subclinical, involving problems with social navigation, theory of mind formation, and other problems that make it difficult for the candidate to navigate the complexities of policing. And then three other new job-relevant correlates: history of physical aggression triggered by antisocial behavior, a history of anger management problems by a wide range of behavioral externalizing and scale scores, as well as negative emotionality, and engaging in conduct unbecoming a police officer, triggered by RC9 and anger proneness, hypomanic activation, and anger proneness. So in the remaining time, let's see if we can answer a few questions. Dr. Q.
Yes, sorry, I had some problems with the mute button here. So I do have a few questions here, and let's see how many we can get through. The first one, are the norms for officer candidates based on a sample of individuals who were hired and subsequently rated positively in terms of their functioning on the job? Or are the scores simply a composite of scores across all applicants, regardless of their functional outcome?
Great question. It's the latter. We wanted to make sure that when you're comparing your scores, you're comparing them to applicants or to candidates, not to simply those that were hired and then were on the job for a year, past probation. That becomes you're comparing then your candidates to an entirely different sample. So we want you to see how deviant the score is from applicants broadly.
Good. Let's squeeze in another one here. Is there evidence as to the MMPI-3 variables related to citizen complaints of excessive use of force?
I'm sorry, I didn't quite catch the question.
Is there evidence for the MMPI-3 variables being related to citizen complaints of excessive use of force? Yes,
there is, and that's included in the PCIR report as well, and several of the studies that are cited. I see one question from a good friend, Michael Cutler, that I'll try to answer, and that is, are the correlations reported against outcome corrected for range? Not on the R's that I showed you from the technical manual. They are corrected in the associated reports that are on the 3 pages of the 9 studies, all of which are summarized in the user's guide.
One more, let's see if we can get it in. What considerations are there for remote on-screen administration of the MMPI-3 for police candidates?
So Q Global has an excellent platform for remote on-screen administration. I would urge you to Google a copy of a paper that Yossi and I published in June in Professional Psychology, Research and Practice that provides guidance on the remote administration of the MMPI instruments. Very important cautionary information in that article. APA has agreed to make it free, so there's no paywall for you to have to deal with.
Great. I'm going to hand it over now to Sherry to close us out.
Well, I'd like to thank everyone. Thank you so much for sharing your expertise with us, Dr. Corey. And thank you, Dr. Quiros and Dr. Kimball, for being on with the chat box. And that does conclude our webinar for today.
Thank you, folks.